Welcome to the second week of our Summer Bible Challenge. At a time when we are kind of still, to some extent, locked down, but doing things on a limited basis. Our small groups aren't meeting at church. We have been able to reopen in-person worship, although so many of us are still worshiping by live stream. We thought during this time it would be good to have a way to pull us together and have us studying the same passages of the Bible. We've had online Bible devotions for some time, but we're kind of amping that up this summer, and we're looking at the 4 P's of the Bible. A sermon series will have those in it, those being people, places, parables or stories, and prayers. So Kathy Baker did an awesome video last week of the first of those P's, people. This week I'm doing the one on places. The idea is that you'll watch this on Sunday afternoon or anytime during the week, but that will help you as we look ahead to the scriptures for this week in the Summer Bible Challenge on the particular word. Like this week it's places. Some of you will be doing this as individual Bible study, and you'll see the adult challenge in the online devotion. Some of you will be doing these as a family, and hopefully all our families will do this. So we have a youth and a children's challenge. And these videos are intended to help you kind of to prepare, think about those as the week begins. Others of you may be using this, and we hope this will happen in small group studies on Zoom or some other format for you to get together electronically. And if you're leading that group or if you're just preparing for discussion in those groups, hopefully these videos will help. As I look at places today, I'm going to do a scan of the scriptures for Monday through Friday, and then Nathan will be lifting up the scriptures usually for Saturday or Sunday as sermon text. So look ahead to those as well. By all means this week, use maps. I love looking up places when I'm reading the Bible, studying the Bible. I love to look up the places on a map. I have a Bible atlas or 2 books that have maps in them, but almost all study Bibles have maps over in the back. And so when a place comes up for the day, whip out one of those maps and go and look up and see what the place looks like. It helps to see what's surrounding that place. Are there any rivers? Are there any mountains? In other words, what's the terrain like? Oftentimes that helps us to understand the reason that the place is significant in Scripture. Now, we come on Monday. We're going to go Monday through Friday of this week. And Monday's Scripture is centered around the place of Mount Sinai, which is a rugged stone mountain surrounded by barren desert on the Sinai Peninsula between Egypt and Israel. I traveled for the first time to the Holy Land in 1992, and we spent our first few days in Egypt and then traveled across the Sinai Peninsula and up into Israel at a place called Eilat. We spent the night on the Sinai Peninsula at a place called St. Catherine's Monastery. It's really out just in the desert at the foot, right at the foot of the Mount Sinai. We got up around 3 or 4 a.m. We'd only gotten to sleep a couple of hours. We got up, and in the dark, we got on board camels. These Bedouin shepherds had brought camels for us, and we rode those camels up to the top of Mount Sinai. The camels could go up until just almost to the very top peak. And there we got off and waited for a little while, and then we saw the sun come up. I can't tell you how beautiful it was to be on Mount Sinai as the sun began to light those surrounding peaks and valleys, and just below us in the distance was the Sinai Desert. It was easy to experience and encounter God's presence there, thinking about and reading the scriptures of God appearing there to Moses in the scripture that we're going to be reading today. God's awesome holiness is described in that scripture. It talks about dramatic ways that people could know that God was there. There were earth tremors. There was smoke on the mountain. There were trumpet blasts. I want you to be looking for something. All of this was scary, but Moses said something to the people to give them assurance. I want you to go looking to see what was it that Moses said with all of this dramatic stuff happening to the people. you may want to find that, think about it, and discuss it in your small group. That's a really good key talking point for discussion in small groups or in your family. Let's move on. Our next day is Tuesday, and it is the Jordan River. Our scripture passage for that is Joshua 3:7 verses chapter 4 verse 7, and this scene coming at the end of the Exodus from Egypt. Isn't it cool how you do places in the Bible that the Mount Sinai yesterday on Monday was at the beginning of the Exodus, Israel's journey across from Egypt into their promised land. This passage comes at the end of that Exodus, and it's led. The Israelites by this time are being led by Joshua. Now the Jordan River has its headwaters above the Sea of Galilee, up in the north. In fact, it starts out in an area pretty close to Caesarea Philippi. We read about in the New Testament. It comes down to the Sea of Galilee, and then it flows out of the Sea of Galilee into the Dead Sea. Although some of the promised land would actually be to the east of the Jordan River when you're looking at a map, when the Israelites come to the Jordan, they see that as the boundary. It's the entrance point into their promised land. Crossing the Jordan was a phenomenal event for the children of Israel. A generation had passed away since Moses had started out with the Israelites and their parents from Egypt. Can you imagine putting your foot into that swollen, flooded Jordan River? It says it was at flood season and the water was high. The river would have been out of banks. The water would have been swift. It would have been scary. This is a place where you could drown. And yet God had told the priest, go ahead, you take up the ark and you shall walk into the water. It would take faith to do that. The symbolism of God protecting the Israelites as they move into those flooded waters of the Jordan is so reminiscent of God's presence with them and God's salvation at the Red Sea, where God parted the waters for them then. When our Christ Church pilgrims went to Palestine this past February, the Jordan River was a highlight for a lot of us to see. In fact, a lot of us had images. People were talking about this on our pre-meetings, and as we went there, people had images of walking out into the Jordan the way Jesus would have been. Jesus was baptized in the Jordan River, and a lot of people had this image of walking out there into the water and renewing their baptism. This would be especially meaningful to them because of the fact that Jesus had been baptized there. But like the day that Joshua and the Israelites came to the Jordan River from the eastern side, they would have been in what today is modern-day Jordan. Well, when we were there, we came to it from the Palestinian or Israeli side, but we found the waters flooded as well. The river was out of banks in some places. There were concrete steps that led down to a kind of a pool area there in the Jordan, and water was way up high on that. Part of the parts where you typically can walk out to and touch the water, they were flooded. And so to remember our baptisms, we just walked down to the bottom of those concrete steps, and we scooped our hands into the kind of muddy water that was actually up on the steps, and we touched our foreheads and remembered. Some took vows to remember their baptism. On Wednesday this week, but before I leave that, it's so cool the way some things have such special significance. Some places have such special significance, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. The Jordan River is one of those. Jesus did so much of his ministry around the Jordan in addition to his being baptized there. So I started to say, now we come to Wednesday, and the place is Jerusalem. There is no more important place in Scripture than the city of Jerusalem. Let's talk a little bit about the Word. By the way, when we're studying the Bible, it is so good to grab an extra resource. There's no study book or lesson guide for our Bible challenge, but we have tons of good resources. Some of those are on the internet. Be careful about internet resources. Make sure they're from a respected source. Wikipedia is not known for its great theological scholarship, but you can go to the internet and get some really good things. I like to use a Bible dictionary, and so I can look up words and see background. Jerusalem is a good example of that. It comes from two words, Jeru and Salem, and the name in the Hebrew means New Salem. It was there a long time before the scriptures that we will read about this week. It was at Jerusalem, that the priest Melchizedek appears in the Old Testament. You may remember that story. Abraham had settled. He had given Lot the more choice land. Abram had taken the more mountainous, rugged area of Palestine, and Lot got himself into trouble, and he was defeated and captured by some area kings and taken off in captivity. He, his family, his neighbors, and all of his possessions. And Uncle Abraham, always comes to his rescue. So Abraham was sent for to go and to rescue Lot. And whenever he went, he defeated those kings who had taken Lot and all of the things away. And the custom, their tradition was that whenever you went and retrieved something like that, all the possessions became yours. They're like spoils of war. They're yours. And so Abraham came home. On the journey, he passed by this place called Jerusalem, and out came a priest, Melchizedek. He's kind of a mysterious figure, but it was there at Jerusalem. I think that's the first time, if I'm not mistaken, that Jerusalem is mentioned in the Old Testament. Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils, all those possessions, to the priest Melchizedek, and then returned the rest of the property to the people from which it had been taken, Lot and his family and his neighbors. But that scripture there at Jerusalem gives us the kind of the origin of the tithe, giving a tithe, as Abraham did there. The scripture for today is it comes from 1 Chronicles 11:1 through 9. I'm guessing that as we read the Bible, I know I'm kind of guilty of this. It's pretty rare that I grab Chronicles, I grab the Bible, and I flip back to the Old Testament, and I look up Chronicles, and I read something from that. I'm much more likely, if I'm in the Old Testament, to read from Genesis or Exodus. I'm much more likely to read from the Psalms or perhaps Isaiah, one of the prophets. I tend to read a lot in the New Testament. Those are all good reading, of course, but it's good sometimes, as we're led this week, to go to a book like 1 Chronicles. If you're reading the Bible through, and I hear people say this, if you begin in Genesis and go to Exodus and you're just reading through the books, you'll read through 2 Kings and you'll hit 1 Chronicles, and you'll likely be hit by two observations. First, you're suddenly studying genealogies, and it's like you're reading now about the genealogies in several chapters in Chronicles, from Adam all the way up to King Saul. If you remember, Saul was the first king of Israel. They'd been ruled by judges. The tribes were kind of a loose-knit group that only came together after they inherited the promised land. They only came together really when they were attacked or needed to come together for a particular reason. They weren't really a nation. Saul was their first king. Chronicles, the second observation you'll have is Chronicles repeats a lot of things. It's like you've read through stuff in 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, and then you hit Chronicles, and it's like, wait a minute, I already read that, didn't I? Chronicles, it pulls the summary. It's kind of like it pulls together and summarizes a lot of history of Israel, written from a little different standpoint, a different writer. The passage for today from 1 Chronicles is the story of David, who was the first king. He was first made king of Judah. I mentioned Saul was the first king. Started out a really, really good king, this tall, good-looking guy who had a lot of personality. But Saul kind of fell apart, and he was not a good leader. Was insanely jealous of David. David became king first of Judah. David was from the tribe of Judah, and the southern tribes were known as Judah. And then uniting the tribes, the northern tribes called Israel, pulling them all together so that they became one nation. To symbolize this, David defeated the Jebusites. They were a group of people who lived in the area of Jerusalem. And once he had defeated the Jebusites, they had a fortress on Mount Zion, and this is where Jerusalem was built. And David established Jerusalem as the capital. Now he does something. He solidified the nation of Israel into one strong nation or country. I want you to look ahead as you lead your family or your small group this week on Wednesday, on today's lesson. I want you to see some things that David would do in the near future after he had conquered the Jebusites, had taken over this city on this Mount Zion called Jerusalem. After he'd taken that city, he did two things to make it the absolute center of the nation of Israel. I'm going to give you two hints. One of those things has to do with the Ark of the Covenant, and two, there was a construction project involved. David didn't do the construction, but he gathered all the materials for that construction project. In modern times, I'd like to ask you this question. In fact, just in the last few years, our country did something to emphasize that the capital of the nation today of Israel, that capital is at Jerusalem instead of at Tel Aviv. This issue of nationality in Palestine, Israel, the Holy Land, is really that's right in the news all the time. Jesus would be crucified and buried in Jerusalem. It's a terribly important city. In fact, Jerusalem is considered a most holy city by people of the faiths of Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And people go there as pilgrims, as we did in February. People go there from all three of those faiths. Jerusalem, a very, very important place in Scripture. Thursday, we come to Babylon. Wow, that name just kind of rolls off, doesn't it? Babylon. We definitely need to get our maps out here. And the map that you'll be using oftentimes will be an Old Testament map. If you can find one in your study Bible or Bible Atlas or whatever you're looking at, you can Google this if you'd like. Babylon in Bible Times. If you just Google that, up will come a map, and it'll be a good resource for you to look at. Way back in middle school or maybe high school, you did some world history, and you learned that civilization, we think, began in a place called Mesopotamia. It was part of the Fertile Crescent, where there was good water and there was good soil, and there was good pasture for animals, good land for crops. Civilization started between the rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates. Babylon, or Babylonia, is the region, the country. Babylon is a city, but Babylonia was on both the east and west side of the Euphrates River. It was located where the modern country of Iraq is today. It's really important for us to kind of get a feel for these things. If you look at a modern map, if you look at Iraq, you'll get a sense of where it is compared to Iran and Kuwait and Israel, Jordan, Syria, all the different countries that we hear about today. So we're talking about Babylon, the city, which is part of the empire of the Babylonians. Now, as a quick background, the nation of Israel split under Solomon's son, Rehoboam, into the northern and southern tribes. They've been a loose-knit group. When David united them, he was really uniting 12 different tribes. Now, when they split, it was north and south. It fell at that time from being a world power where other nations had been conquered by David. It fell from being a world power to being a nation that was constantly attacked by its neighbors. The Egyptians from the south, southwest, the Assyrians from the northeast, and later the Babylonians, who became the Persians. The northern tribes were defeated and taken into exile by Assyria in 722 BC. And then the southern tribes were defeated by the Babylonians, and that was in 586 BC, Old Testament times. So much of the prophecies in the Old Testament talk about what's going to happen if Israel doesn't turn back to God, and they mention being taken away into exile or captivity, and that indeed happened. When the Babylonians defeated the southern tribes, now that's the area that includes Jerusalem that we just talked about, they took the best of the land, the best people of the land. They took the leaders, they took the scholars, they took the craftsmen, and they took them into exile in Babylonia. The book of Jeremiah, that prophecy of Jeremiah, is talking about what's going to happen if we don't turn back to God, and then it talks about it's happened. Jeremiah has a voice of promise, but Jeremiah is in his promise, he's seeing beyond the exile into Babylonia, and he's seeing days that will come afterwards. Daniel is one of those bright young men who are taken from the southern tribes and taken off into Babylon. We say Babylon usually instead of saying Babylonia. As I said earlier, Babylon was really a city in Babylonia, but we kind of refer to the whole empire oftentimes as Babylon. Daniel is one of those stories of people who will not give up their faith to make life easy. Enjoy that story. By the way, Daniel is also an apocalyptic book, meaning that not only does it talk about the times they're in, but it also talks about the future and the fall of 4 great empires. The place, and before I go from there, if you go to the New Testament book of Revelation, that's not our reading for today, but this won't cost you any extra. It's just part of our looking at Babylon. In the New Testament book of Revelation, the name Babylon is used to refer to a completely different empire, an empire that was prevalent and powerful in the 1st century AD. So as you read about this in your family or as you lead discussion about this Babylon in your small groups, be sure and bring this up. Go to the reference in Revelation. It's over toward the back and see just exactly what empire is being referred to. It's interesting how Babylon, when it's used in the Bible, is almost always in a negative context. The exile there where Judah spent so much difficult time, and then in the New Testament with this reference to another empire. We come to Friday and the Sea of Galilee, and probably this is my favorite place of all the places that we've read Scripture about this week. I mentioned earlier that the headwaters of the Jordan River flow into the Sea of Galilee, and then the Jordan River proper flows out of the Sea of Galilee and into the Dead Sea. Now, the Jordan River through time has created a valley, the Jordan Rift Valley or the Jordan River Valley, which is so important, such a key part of Israel's terrain. The Jordan, I mentioned earlier, kind of formed the eastern boundary for the Promised Land. The Sea of Galilee, out of which the Jordan River flows, is a large, I call it a sea, but sometimes in the New Testament it's called a lake. It's 8 miles across at its widest point. It's east to west, and it's about 12 miles from the northern part down to the very tip of the Sea of Galilee. Today, when we go there and see the Sea of Galilee, it's just a little bit smaller than it was in the time of Christ. And you can see with archaeological digs that have taken place around the shore of the Sea of Galilee, you can see how it's kind of shrunk a bit over time, but it's still roughly the size it was in New Testament times. There are a lot of villages like Capernaum that are talked about a lot during Jesus' ministry, during the Gospels. In fact, Capernaum became Jesus' kind of home or headquarters during the 3 years of his ministry. And the ruins of Capernaum are there today, right on the Sea of Galilee. It was a very, very important part of Jesus' ministry. He called a number of his disciples from at the Sea of Galilee. He called them from being fishermen to commercial fishermen to become his followers and disciples, sometimes apostles. We see a lot of Jesus teaching around the Sea of Galilee, doing healing and miracles. We even see him when he calmed the sea. It was the Sea of Galilee. Our passages from Mark during this week show Jesus doing those and all of those activities. Jesus preached or taught on his Sermon on the Mount at a place we think we know where it is. When you go to visit it today and you sit there on the slope looking, you would be looking down at Jesus as he sat on a level place and taught. But as you look over where Jesus would have been sitting, you see, guess what? The Sea of Galilee, a beautiful, beautiful scene. I've been to the Sea of Galilee on both of my visits to modern-day Israel, and of all the places we go, the Sea of Galilee is always my favorite. It seems like I can sense God's presence more there than in any other place, more so than in Jericho, more so than in Bethlehem, which is beautiful, more so than Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is the favorite of so many people because of all the things that happened there and that we've discussed this week. But our lesson for this whole week in looking at all these places is this. These places are important because they show God interacting with people, great events that show relationship and teachings and works of God happen in these particular places. And it's good to have the reference and connection between those events and the place, the name of the place. But you're going to hear this as Nathan preaches this Sunday, I'll bet. And that is this. God is in these places, or was in these places, but God is everywhere. God is in all places. So as you do your devotional reading this week, as you do the Bible challenge, enjoy these places, enjoy your studies together, and God bless you. Thank you.